The sun didn't just rise over the red clay of the valley. It seemed to pull itself up with a heavy groan, much like Arthur did every morning at 5:30. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his feet feeling the familiar grit of the floorboards. Beside him, Beatrice was still breathing in the slow, rhythmic way that told him she was in that deep sleep people only get when they've spent 40 years working the same soil. Arthur reached for his overalls. The denim softened by 1,000 washes until it felt like a second skin. He was 74, and his joints reminded him of that fact every time the weather turned. Today, the air felt thick. A storm had rolled through the night before, a real fence buster, as his father used to call them. He could hear the drip, drip, drip of rainwater falling from the rusted gutter onto the porch steps. He walked into the kitchen, the linoleum worn white in front of the stove, where Beatrice stood every morning. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He didn't need to. He knew this house by heart the way the floorboard near the pantry squeaked. The smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the faint scent of wood smoke that lived in the curtains. He put the kettle on. The blue flame of the gas stove, casting a soft glow against the wood-paneled walls. By the time the water whistled, Beatrice appeared in the doorway, wrapping her quilted robe around her narrow frame. She didn't say good morning. She didn't have to. She just reached for the 2 ceramic mugs with the chipped rims and set them on the table. "Big limb went down near the creek," Arthur said, his voice gravelly from sleep. "I heard it hit around midnight. Sounded like a cannon." Beatrice nodded, blowing the steam off her tea. "The wind was howling, Arthur. I was worried about the old barn. That roof is hanging on by a prayer and a few rusted nails." "I'll go out and check it once the light's full," he replied. "But I think the barn stood its ground." It was something else I heard, something deeper. They finished their breakfast in a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of knowing exactly what the other person is thinking. When the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, painting the puddles in the yard a bright, shimmering silver, Arthur pulled on his boots and grabbed his chainsaw. The farm was 80 acres of history. Some of it was cleared for corn and beans, but a good portion of it was dense woods pine, oak, and ancient hickory trees that had seen things no living man could remember. As Arthur walked toward the back boundary, the smell of damp earth and crushed pine needles was overwhelming. He found the downed limb near the limestone ridge, a place where the earth rose up sharply before dropping off into a ravine. It was an old white oak, maybe 80 years old, ripped right out of the ground. But as Arthur approached the tangled mess of roots and red mud, he stopped dead in his tracks. The tree hadn't just fallen. It had taken a massive chunk of the hillside with it. And there, revealed in the raw, torn earth behind where the roots had gripped the slope, something that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a shadow at first. A rectangular patch of absolute blackness amidst the red clay. Arthur set his chainsaw down, his heart starting to thud against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with his age. He stepped closer, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. It wasn't a hole. It was a doorway. The edges were lined with stacked stones, fitted together so tightly that not even a blade of grass could grow between them. It was a piece of craftsmanship that looked like it belonged in a history book, not tucked away behind a Georgia farm. The storm had acted like a giant hand, peeling back the skin of the earth to show what was hidden underneath. "Beatrice," he called out, his voice cracking. He realized then that he was shaking. He didn't wait for her. He moved toward the opening. The air coming out of the hole wasn't musty or dead. It was cool, moving with a slight draft that smelled of iron and old dry paper. He reached into his pocket for his small brass flashlight. It's the one he used for checking the engine of his tractor. The beam of light cut through the dark. The tunnel didn't drop down. It went straight back into the ridge, level and clean. The floor was packed dirt, hard as concrete. As he took his first step inside, the sound of the outside world, the birds, the wind, the distant hum of a neighbor's truck simply vanished. "Arthur, what on earth are you shouting for?" Beatrice's voice came from behind him, breathless as she made her way through the brush. He didn't turn around. He just pointed the flashlight at the stone archway. He heard her intake of breath, the sound of her hand hitting her chest. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, stepping up beside him. "Arthur, what is this? This wasn't on the survey maps. We've been here 50 years, and we've walked this ridge 1,000 times." "The tree was guarding it," Arthur said softly. "It's been waiting for that tree to fall." They stood on the threshold together, two elderly souls on the edge of a secret. They didn't know yet that what lay 50 feet inside that tunnel would change the way they saw their ancestors, their neighbors, and the very ground they called theirs. They didn't know about the iron boxes, the handwritten letters, or the maps that would redraw the lines of their county. All they knew was that the earth had opened up, and it was calling them inside. Arthur and Beatrice stood at the mouth of the stone entrance for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only a few minutes. The cool air coming from the tunnel felt like a physical hand pressing against their faces. It didn't smell like the outside. Out in the Georgia heat, the air was thick with the scent of pine needles, wet clay, and the sweet, heavy smell of wild honeysuckle. But inside this hole, the air was thin, metallic, and carried the scent of deep time. "Maybe we should call the sheriff, Arthur," Beatrice whispered, her hand gripping the sleeve of his denim jacket. Her fingers were trembling just a little, a movement he felt more than saw. Arthur shook his head slowly. He looked at the way the stones were cut. They weren't jagged or rough. They had been smoothed down by hand, fitted together with a level of care that suggested whoever built this didn't want it to ever fall down. "The sheriff wouldn't know what to make of this, Bee. And once we call him, this stops being ours. Let's just see how far it goes. Just a little bit." He took the first step. The ground beneath his work boots was surprisingly level. It wasn't muddy like the ground outside. It was a fine gray dust that puffed up in tiny clouds around his ankles. He held the flashlight out in front of him, the yellow beam cutting a circle into the gloom. Beatrice followed close behind, so close that her chest was almost touching his back. As they moved deeper, the light from the entrance began to fade into a dim gray rectangle. The silence was the most striking thing. On the farm, there was always noise. The wind in the trees, the crickets, the distant sound of a tractor 3 miles over. But here, the only sound was the heavy thud of their hearts and the scrape of their boots. "Look at the walls," B. Arthur said, his voice echoing softly. He moved the light to the side. Every few feet, there were small niches carved into the rock, just big enough to hold a candle or a small lantern. The soot from fires burned over 100 years ago still stained the stone in dark, greasy smudges. It was a chilling realization. People had lived in this darkness. They hadn't just passed through. They had waited here. They walked for perhaps 50 yards before the tunnel began to widen. The walls transitioned from natural stone to heavy timber supports. Huge logs of heart pine, aged to a deep dark red, held up the ceiling. "Arthur, stop," Beatrice said suddenly. She reached past him and pointed toward the floor. In the corner of the widening room sat a small pile of objects. They looked like trash at first glance. But as Arthur knelt down, his knees popping loudly in the quiet space, he saw they were treasures of a different sort. There was a rusted tin cup, a pair of leather shoes so small they must have belonged to a child, and a heavy iron pot. Beatrice reached down and picked up the shoe. The leather was stiff and cracked, but it had been mended many times. Someone had sewn patches over the toes using thick, uneven stitches. She ran her thumb over the patches, her eyes welling up with tears. "Someone was hiding their baby here," she whispered. While the world was moving up there on the surface, someone was sitting in the dark, trying to keep a child quiet. The human reality of the place started to sink in. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was a sanctuary. Arthur moved the light further back into the room and caught the glint of something metal. It wasn't rusted like the tin cup. It was a dull, heavy gray. It was a chest. It sat in the center of a small, raised stone platform, almost like an altar. It was made of thick wood bound in iron straps, with a heavy padlock hanging from the front. The wood was dark, almost black, and looked as solid as the day it was fashioned. Do you think there's money in there?" Arthur asked. He wasn't a greedy man. He had lived on a meager pension and what the land gave him for years. But the thought of a buried treasure was a natural one. "I don't think it's money," Beatrice said, her voice regaining its strength. She stepped toward the chest. Look at the top of it. Arthur leaned in. Carved into the wood of the lid was a symbol, a circle with a star in the middle, and 3 lines pointing north. Below the symbol, a date was burned into the wood, 1856. That's before the war, Arthur muttered. This has been sitting under our feet since before the Civil War ended. He reached out and touched the padlock. It was cold, but it didn't feel brittle. He knew he couldn't break it with his bare hands. He looked back toward the entrance, then back at the chest. The weight of the discovery was starting to settle on him. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a piece of their history that had been erased from the maps, a secret kept by the earth itself. We need the heavy shears from the barn, Arthur said, and we need more light. If we're going to open this, we're going to do it right. We aren't going to treat this like some junk we found at a yard sale. Beatrice nodded, but she didn't move. She was still looking at the child's shoe in her hand. Arthur, if this is what I think it is, if this was a stop on the way to freedom, then this land isn't just ours. We're just the ones who were picked to look after it. They turned back toward the light of the entrance, leaving the chest in the shadows for a moment longer. As they stepped out into the blinding Georgia sun, the heat hit them like a physical blow. The world looked different now. The trees weren't just trees anymore. They were the descendants of the ones that had hidden the smoke from secret fires. The soil wasn't just dirt. It was a roof for the brave. Arthur gripped Beatrice's hand as they walked back toward the house. They didn't speak. They had a long afternoon ahead of them, and a box that was waiting to tell a story that would shake the foundations of their small town. The walk back to the house felt much longer than the walk to the woods had been. Arthur's legs felt heavy, not just from the age in his bones, but from the sheer weight of what he had seen. He kept looking back over his shoulder at the tree line, half expecting the tunnel to have vanished like a ghost, or worse, for someone else to be standing there. But there was only the quiet swaying of the pines and the occasional call of a crow. Inside the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Beatrice sat at the table, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She hadn't taken her coat off yet. Arthur went to the utility closet and pulled out the heavy-duty bolt cutters and a pair of crowbars. He also grabbed 2 large LED lanterns he usually kept for power outages. "Are you sure we should do this right now?" Beatrice asked. Her voice was small. "Maybe we should sleep on it. My mother used to say that some things are buried for a reason, Arthur. Some spirits don't like to be disturbed." Arthur sat down across from her, the heavy iron tools clattering on the table. "I thought about that, Bea. I really did. But that shoe you found? That wasn't a ghost's shoe. That was a real person. A person who lived in fear on this very land. If they left something behind for us to find, it's a debt we owe them to look. We've lived here 50 years. Why did the tree fall today? Why didn't it fall 10 years ago or 10 years from now?" Beatrice looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the determination there. Arthur wasn't a man who went looking for trouble, but he was a man who finished what he started. She stood up and took off her coat. "Let me get some old towels and a soft brush. If there are papers in there, we can't just grab at them with dirty hands." They headed back out. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long orange shadows across the fields. When they reached the limestone ridge again, the woods felt different. It felt like the trees were leaning in, watching them. Arthur led the way down into the darkness, the bright white light of the LED lanterns making the tunnel look even more imposing than before. They reached the chamber with the chest. Up close, the wood of the box looked even older. It had a deep, dark grain, almost like it had been carved from the heart of an ancient cedar tree. Arthur positioned the bolt cutters over the thick iron padlock. He took a deep breath, looked at Beatrice, and squeezed. The sound of the lock snapping was like a gunshot in the small stone room. Both of them jumped, their hearts racing. The broken lock fell into the dust with a dull thud. Arthur handed the bolt cutters to Beatrice and reached for the lid. It was heavier than it looked. He had to put his shoulder into it, the wood groaning and creaking as the hinges rusted but still strong. Fought against being moved for the first time in over a century as the lid fell back against the stone wall. Faint puff of air escaped the box. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled like dried roses and old cedar. Beatrice held the lantern closer. They didn't see gold coins or silver bars. Instead, the box was packed tight with bundles of leather and cloth. On top of everything sat a small leather-bound book with a brass clasp. Arthur reached in, his hands trembling. He lifted the book out with the reverence of a man holding a newborn baby. He brushed the dust off the cover and unlatched the clasp. The paper inside was yellowed and thin, almost like onion skin, but the ink was still a sharp, dark brown. "It's a ledger," Arthur whispered. He began to read the first page. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a record of every family that had passed through the tunnel. But as he turned the pages, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There were hand-drawn maps of their county, but the lines were different. These maps showed secret trails, hidden wells, and, most importantly, legal descriptions of land. Look at this," he said, pointing to a page near the back. There was a document tucked into the pages. It was a deed, embossed with an official seal from the late 1800s. It described a massive tract of land, nearly 4,000 acres, including the very farm they were standing on. But the name on the deed wasn't a bank or a developer. It was a name Arthur recognized from the old graveyard at the edge of town. It was a collective deed, signed by 12 families, establishing a freedom colony. "If this is real," Beatrice said, her voice shaking as she read the legal jargon, "then the people who bought this land after the war, they never truly owned it. This deed says the land was held in a trust for the descendants of these 12 families. Arthur, that includes your grandfather and mine." The realization hit them like a physical weight. For decades, the local town leaders had told stories of how the old folks had simply walked away from their farms because they couldn't pay the taxes, allowing the wealthy families in town to buy it all up for pennies. But this book suggested something much darker. It suggested that the land had been stolen through a massive, coordinated lie, and the proof of the theft had been buried in this tunnel to keep it safe from those who would have burned it. "We aren't just farmers." Arthur said, looking around the dark chamber. "We're the keepers of the truth. This box. It isn't just history. It's a mountain of evidence." Just then, they heard a sound from the tunnel entrance. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a falling branch. It was the distinct sound of a boot crunching on gravel, followed by the faint light of a different flashlight bouncing off the stone walls. Someone had followed them. Arthur quickly clicked off his lantern, plunging them into total darkness. He pulled Beatrice behind the large chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence of the tunnel, which had felt peaceful moments ago, now felt like a trap. Arthur held his breath so tightly his chest began to ache. He pulled Beatrice closer into the shadow of the stone alcove, his hand instinctively covering her hand where it rested on the cold iron of the chest. The darkness in the tunnel was total, the kind of thick, heavy blackness that made your eyes play tricks on you. But the sound wasn't a trick. Crunch, scrape, crunch. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. A beam of light, much stronger than Arthur's small flashlight, began to dance against the limestone walls of the passage. It moved wildly, scanning the ceiling and the floor. "Arthur," a voice called out. It was a deep, gravelly voice, one that Arthur recognized immediately. It was Silas, a man who lived about 2 miles down the road. Silas was a few years younger than Arthur. It's a man who spent most of his time fixing old tractors and minding everyone's business but his own. "Arthur, you in here? I saw your truck parked crooked by the ridge and the brush all tore up. I thought maybe you'd fallen into a sinkhole." Arthur let out a long, shaky sigh. He reached down and clicked his lantern back on. The sudden light made Beatrice blink and squint. "We're back here, Silas," Arthur called out, his voice sounding thinner than he wanted it to. A moment later, the silhouette of a tall, thin man in a faded baseball cap appeared at the entrance of the chamber. Silas stopped dead, his own flashlight dropping down to illuminate the heavy wooden chest and the scattered papers. His jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to hang there as he looked at the stone walls and the ancient timber supports. "Lord have mercy," Silas whispered, stepping into the room. He took off his cap and wiped a hand over his balding head. "Arthur, Beatrice." What in the world have you two stumbled onto? I've lived in this county 60 years, and I never heard a whisper about a cave on this ridge. It's not a cave, Silas, Beatrice said, her voice regaining its steady maternal strength. She stood up, brushing the dust from her knees. It's a secret. A very old one. Silas walked over to the chest, his eyes wide. He looked like a man who had just walked onto the moon. Is that gold? You found a treasure chest. No gold, Arthur said, stepping between Silas and the chest. He wasn't being mean, but he felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over the papers. It's something better. It's a book of names, Silas, and deeds. It's the history of who actually owns this valley. For the next hour, the three of them sat on the floor of the tunnel, the two lanterns placed in the center like a campfire. Arthur read the names from the ledger. As he spoke, Silas's expression changed from curiosity to shock, and finally to a deep, quiet anger. That's my great-grandfather's name, Silas said, pointing to a signature at the bottom of a yellowed page. We were always told he lost the farm in a card game back in the 20s. My daddy died believing his father was a fool who gambled away our legacy. He didn't gamble it away, Arthur said firmly. He held up a document with a red wax seal. This is a receipt for taxes paid in full for the year 1924. In this letter here, it's from a lawyer in the city, warning the families that the local bank was trying to forge their signatures to take the timber rights. The air in the tunnel felt heavier now, charged with the weight of decades of lies. They realized that the tunnel hadn't just been a place to hide people. It had been a vault for the truth. The families who lived here a century ago knew that a time might come when their history would be erased. So they had tucked the proof under the roots of a great oak tree, hoping the earth would keep it safe until someone honest enough to handle it came along. What are we going to do? Silas asked. He looked at Arthur. If we take this to the courthouse in town, those folks in the records office, some of them are the grandkids of the men who signed these forged papers. They aren't going to just hand over the keys to the county. We can't go to the local authorities, Beatrice said. She had been quiet, thinking. We need someone from the outside. Someone who doesn't care about the town's social circles. We need a lawyer from the city, and we need the newspapers. If this stays a secret, they can make it disappear. But if the whole world sees it, they have to face it. But the cost. Arthur sighed. We're living on a fixed income. A lawyer who can handle a case this big, that costs more than this whole farm is worth. Silas stood up, his face set in a hard line. Not if we all pitch in. There are 20 names in this book. Most of those families are still around, living in trailers or working for minimum wage on land their granddaddies once owned. If I go and tell them, if I show them their names in this book, we won't need a lawyer's fee. We'll have a movement. The plan began to take shape right there in the dark. They wouldn't run to the police, and they wouldn't sell the story to a tabloid. They were going to call a meeting of the descendants, as they began to carefully pack the papers back into the chest to move them to the house. Arthur felt a strange sense of peace. For years, he had felt like a guest on his own land, just a man passing through. But looking at the names in the ledger, he realized he was a link in a long, unbroken chain. They worked together to haul the chest out of the tunnel. It took all three of them, sweating and straining, to lift the heavy wood over the uneven ground. By the time they emerged back into the woods, the sun had set, and a blanket of stars was beginning to stretch across the Georgia sky. They loaded the chest into the back of Arthur's old rusted truck. Silas stood by the tailgate, looking back at the dark hole in the ridge. You think there's more in there? Silas asked. Maybe, Arthur said. But for tonight, this is enough. This is more than enough. As Arthur drove the truck slowly back toward the farmhouse, with Beatrice sitting close to him and Silas following in his own vehicle, he looked out over the fields. The land looked the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed. The shadows of the trees looked like giants. The wind through the corn sounded like thousands of voices, finally being heard after 100 years of silence. He knew the next few weeks would be hard. There would be people in town who would be afraid of what was in that box. There would be threats, and there would be lies told about them. But as he pulled into the driveway and saw the porch light of his home, he knew he wasn't afraid. He had the truth in the back of his truck. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally, truly home. The morning after the meeting at the farmhouse was the quietest morning Arthur could ever remember. The world looked different. The old oak trees, the sagging barn, and the red clay path weren't just parts of a farm anymore. They were pieces of a story that had finally been told. Arthur sat on his porch, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching the fog lift off the fields. For the last few days, their house had been a beehive of activity. People from all over the county had come through their front door. Some came with tears in their eyes, holding old family Bibles that matched the names in the ledger. Others came with fear, wondering if the truth would stir up trouble they weren't ready to face. But through it all, Beatrice had been the rock. She kept the coffee pot full and the kitchen table open for anyone who needed to talk. Silas had stayed true to his word. He had spent his gas money, driving from house to house, spreading the news. He didn't use a loudspeaker or a fancy flyer. He just sat on people's porches and told them what he had seen in the tunnel. By the end of the week, the Tunnel of Truth, as the local folks started calling it, it's become a symbol of something more than just a hole in the ground. The day of the final legal hearing in the city arrived. It was a clear, crisp morning. Arthur and Beatrice dressed in their Sunday best, the same clothes they wore to weddings and funerals. They weren't going to a fight. They were going to witness a homecoming. The courtroom was packed. It wasn't filled with people in expensive suits, but with people in flannel shirts, work boots, and floral dresses. These were the descendants. They sat in the wooden pews, shoulders touching, waiting for a judge to look at the papers that had been hidden for over a century. When the judge walked in, the room fell so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. The lawyer Arthur and Silas had found a young woman who grew up in a town, just like theirs didn't lead with big words or legal tricks. She simply placed the leather-bound ledger on the table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear. "For 100 years, the families of this valley were told they had no history. They were told they had no claim to the land they worked with their own hands. But the earth does not lie. The stones do not forget." She spent hours showing the maps, the tax receipts, and the letters. She showed the child's shoe that Beatrice had found, explaining that it represented the people who had lived and died in the shadows so that their children might one day stand in the light. The defense lawyers, representing the big developers who had planned to turn the valley into a luxury golf resort, tried to argue that the documents were too old to be valid. They tried to say that the statute of limitations had passed. But the judge, a man with gray hair and eyes that seemed to see right through a person, leaned forward. "Justice doesn't have an expiration date," the judge said. His voice echoed through the chamber. "If a house is built on a stolen foundation, it doesn't matter how many years have passed. The foundation is still stolen." The ruling took 3 days to finalize, but when it came, it was a landslide. The land grants were recognized as valid. The Freedom Colony Trust was restored. It didn't mean that people were kicked out of their homes, but it meant that the vast tracts of timberland and undeveloped hills were returned to the community trust. It meant that the families who had been pushed into poverty for generations now had a future. Back on the farm, Arthur and Beatrice stood by the limestone ridge. The tree that had fallen was now cleared away, but the tunnel entrance remained. They had decided not to seal it up. Instead, with the help of the community, they had turned it into a small, quiet place of reflection. They placed a simple wooden bench near the entrance and a plaque with all the names from the ledger. "You think they know Arthur?" Beatrice asked, looking at the stone archway. "The ones who built it. Do you think they know we found it?" Arthur smiled, a slow, peaceful movement of his weathered face. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of purple and gold. "I think they've been waiting for us this whole time, Bea. They didn't build a tunnel just to hide. They built it to bridge the gap between their time and ours. They knew that eventually someone would come along who was willing to listen." As the stars began to poke through the evening sky, Arthur took Beatrice's hand. They walked back toward their house, their footsteps light on the red clay. They were old, and their joints still ached, but they walked with the pride of people who knew exactly where they stood. The secret was out. The debt was paid. The land was finally at peace. The tunnel stayed there, cool and quiet, a silent witness to a story that would never be forgotten again. And as the night settled over the Georgia hills, the voices of the past seemed to fade into a satisfied hum, leaving the valley in the hands of those who truly loved it. The first winter after the discovery was the coldest the valley had seen in years. But for Arthur and Beatrice, the house had never felt warmer. The heavy iron chest now sat in the local community center, protected by glass and guarded by the pride of the town. But the real treasure wasn't the box. It was the way the neighbors looked at one another when they passed on the gravel roads. There was a shared secret, a shared strength, and a shared future that hadn't been there before the storm. Blew that old oak tree down. Arthur spent most of his mornings in the workshop behind the house. He wasn't fixing tractors as much these days. Instead, he was carving small wooden birds out of cedar scraps. His hands, though stiff with the morning chill, moved with a newfound lightness. Every time he looked out the window toward the ridge, he felt a sense of relief that was hard to put into words. It was the feeling a man gets when he finally puts down a heavy sack he's been carrying for miles. He didn't have to worry about the land developers anymore. Their fancy cars and clipboards had vanished the moment the judges' gavel hit the wood in the city courtroom. Beatrice spent her time organizing the legacy project. She didn't want the story to just stay in a book. She wanted the children to know it. On Saturdays, the kitchen would be filled with the scent of cinnamon and yeast as she baked bread for the neighborhood meetings. Young people, who used to talk about leaving the valley the moment they graduated high school, were now staying to help clear the old trails and map out the boundaries of the new community trust. "Do you remember how quiet it used to be, Arthur?" Beatrice asked one evening. They were sitting by the wood stove, the orange light flickering across the walls. It was a lonely kind of quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. Arthur nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I remember. It felt like we were just caretakers of a graveyard. But now it feels like the land is breathing with us. I saw Silas's boy out there yesterday. He was measuring the soil for a community garden. He told me he's going to plant the same kind of heirloom corn his great-grandfather used to grow. He found the seeds in an old jar in his attic." Silas himself had changed the most. The man who used to be the town gossip had become the valley's unofficial historian. He spent his days in the archives of the county seat, cross-referencing the names from the tunnel ledger with the dusty records in the basement. He had uncovered even more stories of bravery, secret meetings under the moonlight, and how the community had looked out for one another during the hardest years of the 1930s. One afternoon, a stranger pulled into Arthur's driveway. He wasn't a developer or a lawyer. He was an older man, maybe even older than Arthur, with skin the color of polished mahogany and a suit that had seen better days but was pressed perfectly sharp. He got out of his car and stood looking at the limestone ridge for a long time before walking up to the porch. "Can I help you, sir?" Arthur asked, stepping out to meet him. The man smiled, and it was a tired but beautiful expression. "My name is Otis. I drove 600 miles because I saw a picture of a child's shoe on the news. My grandmother used to tell me a story about her little brother. She said they had to leave his shoes behind when they ran through a hole in the earth. She cried about those shoes until the day she passed away. She felt like she had left a piece of him in the dark." Beatrice, hearing the voices, came to the door. When she saw the man and heard his story, she didn't say a word. She just went inside and brought out the small, mended leather shoe they had found that first day. She placed it in the man's trembling hands. Otis sat down on the porch steps and wept. They weren't sad tears. They were the tears of a man who had finally found a lost relative. He stayed for dinner, and then he stayed the night. He told them stories of where his family had gone after they left the tunnel, how they had moved north, built businesses, and raised teachers and doctors. But he said they always felt like a tree with its roots cut off. Finding this, Otis said, gesturing toward the ridge in the moonlight, "It's like the roots just grew back. I can go home and tell my grandkids exactly where they come from. I can tell them their ancestors weren't just victims. They were architects. They built a world under the world so that we could have this one. As the months turned into a year, the Tunnel of Truth became more than a local story. People from all over the country started to visit. They didn't come for a tourist attraction. They came for a pilgrimage. They wanted to touch the stones and see the names. Arthur and Beatrice never charged a penny. They just asked that people bring a story of their own to share. On the anniversary of the storm, the community held a feast. They set up long tables right in the middle of the field, near the spot where the old oak had stood. There was music, fiddles and banjos and voices, raised in songs that had been passed down through the generations. Arthur stood at the head of the table. He looked at the faces, the young, the old, the neighbors he had known for decades, and the strangers who felt like kin. He raised his glass of apple cider, his hand steady. "We spent a lot of years thinking we were poor," Arthur said, his voice carrying over the quiet evening air. "We thought all we had was 80 acres of red dirt and a pile of bills. But it turns out we were sitting on a gold mine the whole time. It just wasn't the kind of gold you put in a bank. It was the kind of gold you put in your heart. It was the truth. And the truth has made us the richest people in Georgia." The cheer that went up from the table was loud enough to shake the leaves on the trees. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of deep red and soft violet, the lanterns were lit along the path to the tunnel. Arthur and Beatrice walked back to the house together, trailing a bit behind the crowd. They stopped for a moment at the edge of the porch. The world was at peace. The legacy was safe. And as they stepped inside and closed the door, the valley was finally, truly free. The seasons continued to turn over the valley, but the passage of time felt different now. It no longer felt like things were simply getting older and wearing out. It felt like things were ripening. The red clay of the farm, which had once seemed like a stubborn burden to plow, was now viewed with a kind of sacred respect. Every person who walked the path toward the limestone ridge stepped a little lighter, as if they were walking through a library where the books were. Made of earth and stone, Arthur found himself sitting on the porch more often these days. He wasn't as fast as he used to be, and his breathing came a little shorter when the humidity sat heavy in the Georgia air. But his mind was clearer than it had ever been. He watched the young volunteers from the city university, young men and women with clipboards and soft brushes, as they worked alongside Silas to document every inch of the tunnel. They didn't come to take things away. They came to learn. They treated Arthur like a king and Beatrice like a queen. Though the couple always laughed and told them to save that talk for the history books, one morning, Beatrice sat at the kitchen table with a stack of old photographs and the ledger from the chest. She was working on a memory map. It wasn't just a map of where the fences and creeks were, but a map of where people had lived, where they had hidden, and where they had celebrated. She had been interviewing the elders who came to visit, recording their voices on a small tape player Arthur had bought her. "Arthur, listen to this," she said, waving him over. She pressed play on the recorder. A thin, crackling voice filled the kitchen. It was an elderly woman from 3 counties over. "My mama told us that, when the moon was thin, we had to look for the leaning pine. She said if you found the tree that leaned toward the sunrise, you were safe. We never knew what she was talking about until we saw the news about your farm." Arthur looked out the window. Right there, near the entrance to the tunnel, was a massive, ancient pine tree that leaned at a sharp angle toward the east. He had seen that tree every day for 50 years. He had even thought about cutting it down for firewood back in the hard winter of '84. He felt a chill go down his spine. The signs had been there the whole time, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to have the key to read them. "We walked past our own history every single day." Arthur said softly, sitting down across from her. "We thought we were just living, but we were walking on top of a miracle." Beatrice reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Her skin was thin like parchment, but her grip was still full of the strength that had kept their family together through lean years and loss. "Maybe we weren't supposed to find it until now, Arthur. Maybe the world wasn't ready. If we had found this when we were young and hungry, maybe we would have sold the land. Maybe we wouldn't have understood that the papers in that box are worth more than any amount of money." As the afternoon sun began to stretch its long fingers across the linoleum floor, a group of local school children arrived. They came once a week now. They didn't stay in the house. They went straight to the learning barn that Silas and the neighbors had built using timber from the fallen oak. Arthur walked out to meet them. He liked the way their eyes went wide when he told them about the night of the storm. "Was it scary, Mr. Arthur?" a little boy asked, his eyes fixed on the dark line of the woods. Arthur knelt down, his knee giving a familiar pop. "It wasn't scary, son. It was like hearing an old friend finally speak up after a long time being quiet. You see, the earth has a long memory. It remembers the footsteps of people who were brave, and it remembers the names of people who were forgotten. Our job is just to make sure we keep listening." The children followed Silas toward the ridge, their bright jackets looking like colorful birds against the green of the pines. Arthur stayed behind for a moment, looking at the house. It was a simple, house-white paint, peeling in places. A tin roof that sang in the rain, and a porch that leaned just a little to the left. But it was the center of a new world, that evening. As the house grew quiet and the crickets began their nightly song, Arthur and Beatrice went for a walk. They didn't go far, just to the edge of the garden where the soil was dark and rich. They stood there together, looking out over the valley. In the distance, they could see the lights of other houses and neighbors who now owned their land outright. Families who were no longer afraid of a knock on the door from a developer. "We did a good thing, didn't we?" Beatrice whispered, leaning her head against Arthur's shoulder. "We didn't do it alone," Arthur replied. "The ones who came before us did the hard part. They did the hiding and the waiting. We just did the finding." They stood there for a long time, two old souls in a valley that was finally at rest. The tunnel was there, a cool, dark vein of truth running through the hill. The chest was safe. The names were known, and as the stars came out, one by one, lighting up the Georgia sky like 1,000 tiny candles, Arthur knew that even when they were gone, the story would live on. The land would never be silent again.